Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As you can see, we're running a little bit late. We blame the weather for that. The rain seems to slow everything down, but then again, so does the sun. And the other day, as the blossoms were falling from the trees, that seemed to slow me down as I was walking into work as well. Ended up on my butt a couple of times, but anyway. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome you here to this event, Mexico Today, in which we're launching a new book by Luis Rubio, Mexico Matters. This book is a treatment of really where Mexico is today, a balanced presentation of what's happening in the country across diverse sectors of interest, not only in Mexico, but of course here in DC and across the United States. I'd like to recognize a couple of people who are here in the audience today. Governor Lázaro Cárdenas, very nice to see you. Mario Hernandez from Western Union, and many other friends who are seated around the table here today. It's great to have you here. I don't want to delay things much longer, but I'd just like to begin with the end. As those of you who may have seen an advanced copy of the book know that Luis is very measured in his treatment of Mexico. He's measured in the sense that he doesn't fall into the overwhelming pessimism nor the overwhelming optimism that many people seem to engage in with regards to Mexico. One of the most extraordinary things I think that we've seen over the past few years is how we've gone from all worshipping Brazil to suddenly worshipping Mexico. And I always thought that both things were rather dangerous. But Luis ends his book by saying that the opportunity is extraordinary. And that's a very, very important statement. But the question is now, so how do we act on that? How do we actually bring that opportunity to fruition? So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Luis, who I'm going to pass the microphone over to. Luis Rubio from CIDAC. CIDAC is co-sponsoring this event with us, and we're very grateful for the collaboration that we've had with you over the years, and we hope it continues into the future. Thank you, Luis.
Let me start out actually by prior agreement, if that's okay. Let me say a few words, I'll turn it over to Luis here. First of all, thank you everyone who's here to follow with Duncan. Then thank you to our panelists. This is actually a series that we started, I think, 2 years ago. 3 years ago on Mexico Today, trying at the beginning of every year to sort of frame where Mexico is for a U.S. audience. And we're glad to have some people joining us by web, as well as those that are here with us in the room today. And really the idea is bringing extraordinary people, and we have an extraordinary group of panelists today you're going to hear from, in addition to Luis, who give us different ideas about where Mexico is and where Mexico's going in the future, as sort of a way as we begin the year and as this relationship heats up once again. We know President Obama is going to Mexico. A number of senior Mexican officials are coming to Washington as well, really having a framework for people in this country to understand where things are going. We're very fortunate to have started this with Luis and CIDAC, and Carlos has been part of this, and Carlos Elizondo you hear from in a bit in the past as well. And so and we have the extra fortune this time that this coincides with the book that Luis is launching today. And so Luis, tell us about the book, and then we'll carry on and talk about the rest of the issues.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Andrew. This, I think, is an opportunity for me to talk about both the book, how I see the new reality in Mexico after I finished the book, and to explain why this book and why now. 3 years ago, I spent here 3 months at the Wilson Center, thanks to Andrew. Very Mexican-like. I applied very late, and he responded immediately. And I will ever be grateful to him for that. One of the things that I found very quickly while being here was that the project I came to work on was the wrong one. That the discussions about Mexico, of which I became part of immediately, whether they were about migration or the economy, security, or politics, elections, or whatever else, I had to be participating in all of this fora throughout the city, and some of them outside the city. One of the things that I found was that the discussion about Mexico in Washington tends to be very Washingtonian. Very little of it has to do with what's happening elsewhere, and that's maybe true about Iraq or about other places. It's as if the issues having taking place in Kabul are about DC, not about the development of Afghanistan. So what I thought was, or what I realized then was that there was no presence of what was happening in Mexico from a Mexican perspective. And I don't mean to represent Mexico here. It's a perspective, my perspective, of what's happening. And the book is structured that way. It's a perspective of what's happening in the economy, in the political arena, in the bilateral relationship, in the security space. And it's an attempt to frame the discussion of Mexico in terms of the reforms and changes that have been taking place in that country over the last 3 decades, and many of them 2.5 decades ago, mostly first in the economy and then in the political arena. Some of them planned, some of them the result of a lack of planning, and that's what the book relates. As Andrew says, it's a half glass full presentation of what's happening in Mexico. I don't mean to be positive or negative. I think that the real issue is that that a change in government does not the reality change. It can affect and can change perceptions. And of course, the new administration has radically transformed the perceptions about Mexico, and rightly so, and nobody can quarrel with that. And as everybody knows, in politics, perception is reality, and the reality, therefore, has changed. The real question in my mind is whether the reality can match the current level of perceptions, or can be brought to match the level of perceptions today. And that is an issue of policy, of public policy, of political action, of the movement and the decisions that are made, and the success or failure that come thereafter. The irony, of course, is that this is exactly the opposite of what was happening a few months ago. We had lousy perceptions and one reality. We have now the same reality with wonderful perceptions. Hence the genius of the new administration. They have a very keen sense to reestablish the government as the source of authority and the centerpiece of society. The president at the core of that. It's an issue of power, of concentrating power, of exercising power, and getting things done. What those things are is what I think is the issue that we have to talk about. The record so far, at least by the one standard measure, is impressive. Major pieces of legislation have been passed. Control of the communication process is extraordinary. The will to deal with the illegal obstruction of roads, for instance, is there. There was a major action last Friday in the highway to Acapulco, where a group of dissident teachers were hindering the movement of cars, and the government, for the first time, almost literally since 1968, there are a few small exceptions, but almost literally since 1968, for the first time decided to take action and move and remove the teachers, which was applauded by one part of Mexican society, was criticized by another. But as one analyst put it in one paper, legislating does not mean or is not equal to governing. The fact that when people in the U.S., in a country with very strong institutions, launch and wage their battles in the legislative, in the political process, because that's where decisions are made, and once a law has been passed, it becomes the law of the land, and everybody has to abide by it. In Mexico, passing a law is just passing a law. It doesn't mean that reality changes. The real battle starts in the implementation of the law. So the affecting the vested interests that have to be modified and changed by the new legal reality happens after the legal process, not during the legal process. We have lots of laws that simply are irrelevant in reality. So the fact that changes take place in the legislature does not guarantee a change elsewhere, just as much as a change in the leadership of a union and the putting in jail a very brave act and a very an enormously and a very potentially very important one does not guarantee that there will be a change in that structure or sector. In fact, much of the political conflict is yet to come when, and more important, if those legislative reforms are actually implemented, or if there's an attempt to implement them in reality. The point is that the president has redefined the structure and source of power, but it's not obvious that he has an equally developed strategy for development. There will be a panel after this on security, but one can already tell that 9.5 months after the election, there is still no strategy or different strategy for security. So the question is, will there be something different? The model for this administration is the 1960s, where the government was at the core of society, where the president was unchallenged, where there was lots of investment in infrastructure, where the economy grew very rapidly at an average of almost 7%, where private investment followed government investment in infrastructure, and where the government was the key factor of investment in infrastructure. While this approach worked in the context of a closed economy, in a closed and protected economy, where foreign investment was relatively minor, or at least a minor component of this. The question is, will this work in the context of the era of globalization, the internet, and the information economy? Can something like that be viable? Power is therefore being accumulated, and the question is what for? What will the president use the power for? I believe, and that's the last line of the book, that this is an immense opportunity precisely because this is a decisive president, a decisive administration, with now the means to carry out significant reforms. But there is no guarantee that they will come about. The president is also benefiting from something very important that is not his doing, but he could benefit greatly from it. And that is the fact that very profound and very important reforms took place 2.5, 3 decades ago. The most important of which was the liberalization of the economy, out of which eventually came the negotiation on trade and investment with the US called NAFTA. NAFTA has become the single most important force for investment and for growth in the Mexican economy. And more than that, NAFTA has become the fact that guarantees the permanence of those policies. And the fact that it took almost 20 years for that change in economic development strategy to liberalization to come to fruition and to come to become a factor of growth, or the most important factor of economic growth in Mexico's economy, was possible largely because NAFTA made it impossible forced governments to stay the course, made it impossible not to stay the course. And in that, NAFTA is what has been fulfilling its objective, which was to be a political straitjacket, more than anything else, to be a guarantee for investors, but also a straitjacket for Mexican governments not to change course. And that is often underestimated or ignored in Washington, or in the debates in Washington. More than anything, I think, and I'll conclude with this: the opportunity is there. The two governments are communicating and need to communicate and need to learn how to get things done. But on the Mexican side, Mexico has to decide, Mexico's government has to decide what it wants to get accomplished. It's not simply securing power, it's using that power. And the question is what for and how to do it. Let me conclude with one thing about the book itself. I first of all, I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to get the book published and published by the Woodrow Wilson Center. When I asked Andrew about a year ago about the possibility, he immediately agreed to it. Miguel Salazar was in charge of the project here at the center, and he was permanently willing and able to get things done. Chris made this possible, the organizing this event, and Duncan worked to get to today as we're doing. I'm very grateful for all of you. And I'm grateful for the opportunity of getting this published and this event taking place today as it has been for the last 3 years. Thank you.
Well, first of all, congratulations to Luis on publishing this book. We're honored to be able to publish it. The last time that we published something Luis wrote, which was a couple of years ago on the Mexican middle class with Luis de la Calle, it actually sent shockwaves through the media in the U.S. It actually appeared in op-eds and editorial pages all around the country, and I have no doubt that this book will be the same. Thank you to Duncan for inviting me to comment here, and Luis as well. I don't get to do enough work on Mexico and U.S.-Mexico relations, which is where my heart lies these days. So it's great to be able to talk about these issues. And let me recognize also Lázaro Cárdenas, who's here. Great to see you. And Mario Hernandez, also from Western Union. So good to have you both here, who are important contributors to the Wilson Center. I think the title that Luis chose for this is not accidental. Mexico Matters. It is both the matters of Mexico, trying to interpret to an American audience what is going on in Mexico, the matters of Mexico itself, but also the fact that Mexico matters to the United States, right? And I'm fond of saying that there are probably, 3 countries that will shape day-to-day life in the United States more than any others, and that's probably Mexico, Canada, and China, for different reasons. China is a global player, but also hugely important in day-to-day life in the United States. And Canada and Mexico we tend to forget about, but this is actually a good thing. And I know this is frustrating for colleagues in Mexico and for good friends in Mexico and my family in Mexico, but that Americans tend to forget about Mexico, but we also forget about Canada, right? We also forget about the United Kingdom. We tend to forget about countries with which we actually have a fairly fluid relationship. Mexico we pay more attention to than we do with Canada, largely because we don't have as fluid a relationship with Mexico as we do with Canada. It's a newer discovery for us, as it is for Mexicans, to deal with each other. But it actually is a fairly fluid relationship, given the number of issues and the newness with which we interact with each other. It actually is a quite fluid relationship. And it's a relationship that is deeply embedded in day-to-day life in the United States. It's embedded in the food we eat. It's embedded in the cars we drive. It's embedded in the people we know. It is embedded in who we are. It is embedded in simply daily interactions. The same thing as the relationship is with Canada. These are deeply interpersonal, intermestic relationships. I'll come back to that in a second, but let me say something about the book itself, which is, I think Luis has tried to present exactly what he said earlier. It's the glass half full image of Mexico. This is not a PR piece about how wonderful Mexico is. We can find those. PR people do PR pieces on
Wait for
countries.
the third book.
The third Mexico Triunfante, right? The Mexico triumphs. No, but this is a realistic portrait of Mexico's challenges, right? And Mexico has real challenges. You're going to hear from Carlos and Edna and others later today about some of these challenges, Ariel and others, about the challenges. I mean, there are real challenges in Mexico. It's a country that is still dealing with a high crime rate, that still is trying to reform parts of the economy. And as Luis said, there are major reforms happening on paper, which are hugely important. They probably do move the goalposts, but then how you implement them matters a great deal also. Whether an education reform leads to a change in education is not an automatic given, right? I mean, so we have to actually follow what happens there. So, this is not a book that is unconscious of that in any way, but it does try and show the fact that Mexico is changing, and Mexico indeed is changing. I mean, a much larger middle class than we've seen in the past, higher income than we've seen in the past. It is a democratic society with all the good and bad that come with it, an imperfect democratic society, but then so are we, right? I mean, so it is a society that has changed enormously. Part of the reason why I think you see so many reforms happening right now is indeed the question of democracy, right? I mean, many of us, I think, would have said the pre-coming back, are you going to see major reforms in things like education? No, of course not. Their attention is elsewhere. Well, this is actually a tribute to the fact that the government that was elected actually realizes it has to govern with a mandate given by people. And it was a narrow mandate, actually. It was a very close election in some way. It wasn't close between first and second, but it was a 38% that the president won with. And so, actually has to win the confidence of the other 62% of the population. And actually has to respond to issues that are on Mexicans' minds. That is a tribute to democracy in Mexico. That is a tribute to a changed country. The fact that issues like justice reform are being talked about, I'm sure Edna will talk about that, are a tribute to the fact that these are things that are on Mexicans' minds and therefore are now on politicians' minds. Because, well, democracy is deeply imperfect, but it does seem to move things forward in different ways. Let me say that, I've written this in a book that isn't out yet, but I will say something controversial that I've written there, which is in many ways, if you want to choose a symbolic date for Mexico's, the Mexico that we see today, I would choose January 1st, 1994. Now, all symbolic dates are artificial, all symbolic dates are artificial constructions, but two things happened on January 1st, 1994. One was the entrance of NAFTA into effect. Huge change of Mexico reoriented the economy, a very painful change that 2 decades later seems to be bearing fruit in very significant ways. But it took 2 decades. It was a long process. It began to restructure the economy, but restructuring the economy was painful at times. Today, however, it does seem to be bearing fruit in very important ways. And the second was the Zapatista uprising. The Zapatista uprising was about many things, above all indigenous rights in the state of Chiapas, but it also became a lightning rod for a democratic movement in Mexico and for Mexicans' aspirations for a democratic society. And most people, if you would ask on January 1st, 1994, I actually lived in Mexico at the time, most people were sort of in one camp or the other. Either they loved the Zapatistas or they loved NAFTA. Very few people sort of sat on both, straddled both sides. But if you look backwards, almost 20 years later, I think you almost have to look at both of those processes as being part of where Mexico is today. One is this huge energy unleashed by Mexico's democratic opening, which the Zapatista rebellion played an important role in galvanizing public opinion. It may or may not have been directly a piece of that, but it certainly galvanized public opinion, and enormously important for unleashing Mexico's ability to become a democratic society, to hold the government accountable, and even things as frustrating as they are, things like rule of law, which are serious debates in Mexico today, certainly imperfect, certainly frustrating, but are serious debates that are happening right now. On the other side, NAFTA, which really immersed Mexico for the first time in the global economy. And yes, there had been an opening in the 1980s and so on, but really, as Lee said, locked in a lot of the changes that have, where Mexicans said, look, we ultimately have to become part of the global economy. We ultimately have to deal with a neighbor to the north, like it or not. We may prefer to be, to have a relationship with Europe or Japan or anywhere else, but the reality is the one country that we can really deal with, or the two countries, are the United States and Canada somewhat reluctantly at the time. And it really did begin the restructuring of Mexican society and unleash a lot of the entrepreneurship that you see today in Mexico. And the entrepreneurship is critical. And I think that is the bottom line of this book, and I think it's the bottom line of the larger conversation today in Mexico today. There are lots of things happening in Mexico. We tend to fixate, particularly in Washington, on the political changes and on what the gobierno en turno, the government that's in functions, is doing. But the reality is Mexican society has changed. The Mexican economy has changed. And as a result of that, we are seeing politicians catching up and responding and beginning to do the right thing, and that's a good thing. That's, maybe we hope the same thing happens in our country as well, if we can ever get anything out of our Congress. Let me, finish by saying that what happens in Mexico is not just matter for Mexico, and I think everyone in this room knows that. That's why you're here. Mexico is what happens in Mexico is obviously a Mexican story, but it will have enormous impact on what happens in the United States. If Mexico continues to grow at the pace that it's growing, and Mexico is not growing at the pace of China or India, but it's growing at a steady, ongoing pace for about 15 years. One awful year in there, thanks to the Budweiser crisis from the U.S. Remember the tequila crisis, now the Budweiser crisis. Other than that terrible year, Mexico really has had slow, steady growth, good macroeconomic management, an expanding middle class. This has a huge impact on the United States. It'll have a huge impact. Mexico's our second destination for exports. As Chris Wilson has written, we do a lot of joint manufacturing. And so if we see, if the Mexican economy takes off, it has a huge impact on the United States. Probably the only other country that could have the same impact on us is Canada. And Canada is likely to grow at a much slower level. It's a much more developed economy. Mexico has a huge potential both to grow for its own good, but also to be a huge factor in the future of the United States. And secondly, I think one of the things we often miss, but But increasingly, as Mexico has become more confident in its global affairs, and not just dealing with the United States, but dealing on a range of global affairs, we become partners talking about a lot of major regional and occasionally global issues. And this is a partnership that will develop in new and innovative ways. And I think you're going to see President Obama and President Peña Nieto talk about this coming up. I mean, not only do we talk about the issues on the table between our two countries, but increasingly we talk about larger issues. And that's what happens in mature partnerships between countries, is the ability to talk about other things. And finally, I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the next few weeks on two issues that we're grappling with in this country, that matter for this country and for our future, in the way that many of the issues that Luis writes about in Mexico matter for Mexico's future but have an impact on the U.S. There are two issues we're grappling with that matter for our future as a country but only have a huge impact on Mexico, and one is guns. I don't think anyone's under the illusion that background checks would solve the issue of gun smuggling to Mexico. I mean, it's much more complicated, but there is no magic bullet on any of these things. So actually getting progress on this issue would be very significant. If we do something that at least makes it harder for organized crime groups to get weapons and export them to Mexico, they'll find ways around it, sure, of course they will, but it'll elevate the cost to do that, and it'll trap a few people in the process. Yeah, that's good. It's not perfect. It's not the ultimate solution, but it's a big step in the right direction. That's a good thing. And secondly, immigration. And immigration is something that we need to grapple with for our own well-being in this country, not because it helps our relationship with Mexico or El Salvador, Dominican Republic, or the Philippines, but it will. But in the end, if we do it for the right reasons, which is because we need to deal with immigration for our own competitiveness as a country and for our own democratic values as a country, it will have a huge impact on our relationship with Mexico. So as Mexico grows and evolves, it has an enormous impact on the United States. But as we grow and evolve and change and begin to grapple with some of these issues that we really need to grapple with, it'll also have a huge impact on our relationship with Mexico. And in a mature partnership between two countries, that's exactly as it should be. So, Luis, thank you for giving us this contribution. It may have a great impact on the discussion. Very timely as we're grappling with these issues in this country also to have this out there and have this in lots of people's hands and libraries. So, do we have time for questions, or we go next panel, or what's the mechanic?
I think it makes sense to take a few questions right now. We have about 15 minutes before we move on to the next panel. So, yes, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself and before you make a question. Sir, yeah, the microphone will come around.
Hi, I'm Dolia Esteves, Mexican journalist in Washington. I wanted to ask you about the upcoming meeting between President Obama and President Peña Nieto. As we know, Obama is traveling to Mexico, and this is going to be the first meeting of the two of them as presidents. So there's a lot of expectation of what could come out. What's your reading? Do you think we should expect something substantial, or is it more the value of the meeting is more symbolic than any other thing?
I'm sure that Andrew would have a different perspective, but let me say two things. One is that for Mexico, liberalizing its economy and shifting its strategy of development 20, 30 years ago was much more profound than one can assume, because up to then the U.S. was always seen as the enemy, as the whipping boy. For Mexico, it was that shift entailed accepting that the U.S. was part of the solution to Mexico's problems. So it was a radical redefinition of Mexican politics. And that is what the Mexican government, now from PRI, has to grapple with, it itself coming from that historical tradition, not from the technocrats that came after, but from the previous tradition of inward-looking Mexican politics. So the first thing is accepting and seeing the U.S. as a partner, as part of the solution. But in terms of your specific question, I think that the big challenge today for the relationship is far more serious than one can assume. The U.S. is working on two big issues. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The other is the Atlantic, a negotiation across the Atlantic with Europe. For Mexico and for Canada, it is absolutely critical that those two negotiations, but particularly the one with Europe, be a NAFTA negotiation, not the US negotiation. And the reason for that is that the two other economies, Canada and Mexico, would be deeply affected whether they are part or they are not in that negotiation. So from Mexico's perspective, I believe that the single most important issue vis-a-vis the US today is that one. The rest is what are part of the daily interactions that are very complicated, very active in functional arenas on the bilateral reality, which have to do with the issues that Andrew just mentioned, as well as with the simply workings of the security issues, the border issues, the water issues, everything that is complicated in the relationship, and that includes the most diverse series of activities. But I think at the political and policy level, the single most important issue is, will this be a regional issue or will this be a US issue? I don't think there's a single most important issue today.
I would agree that's going to be a huge issue. I would say it's worth noting that, you know, after the Middle East trip, this is Obama's next trip. Symbolically, this matters. But also, I think the security issue has not gone away. I think we're talking about it less. I think the TPP issue is huge. And I think the broader economic issue is huge. Chris's op-ed today talks about how we manage the border, which I think is a really practical issue, how we actually make the border work in our favor for economic competitiveness and not against us, as we often do today. And something the two governments, to their credit, have been doing for the last few years, but really needs to continue driving on. How you then add the TPP in there and look at a regional strategy for negotiating that, how you handle the cooperation on security with new governments and new tone, and a new relationship. I think the two governments are feeling that out still, and that's justified. And there may be some fun surprises. I mean, I would not be surprised if the two governments didn't try and do something on education, for example, which is a hugely, you know, it's not going to supplant economic integration and security cooperation as the number one day-to-day issue in cooperation, but it's actually a huge opportunity. We could actually be in a situation where we take better advantage of each other's educational system. I mean, Americans to learn and develop the language and cultural capacities to deal with the 21st century, and Mexicans to take advantage of particularly graduate education in science and technology, in STEM areas. I mean, there was a lot we could be doing on these issues. I would not be surprised if there weren't an attempt to move that direction, and maybe other things that are sort of creative, out-of-the-box ideas that we could do together in addition to what we're already going to do. So I think it's an important trip, both symbolically, but also there may be some real practical sides coming out of this.
Thank you. Dennis Gilbert, Hamilton College. Mexico has this huge reform agenda: telecommunications, energy, education, and you said there's a big gap between legislation and implementation. This was not exactly news. But I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit. I mean, this could be a whole day here at the Wilson Center, but what do you see as the prospects, the big issues in terms of reform in these areas?
Well, I can tell you what I would like to see from the reforms. I can tell you what the process of reforming entails. Let me briefly try to address both. If you look at the communications reform, which is now stuck in the Senate in Mexico, having been passed in the lower house of Congress, the bigger issues is this just an attempt to clamp down on the power of the existing incumbents, or is this the beginning of a transformation of an industry to create much more competition within both telecommunications and media industries that are ever more becoming one and the same? I think that so far we have evidence that this is more a power issue than an economic transformation issue, but it could go the other way. In education, we've seen a reform that was passed that was mostly turning into law the so-called Alliance for Education that was agreed to 4 or 5 years ago. Now has to be implemented, and implementing a reform in education, for instance, means This new law has three key components. One is that the teachers have to undergo a yearly evaluation process. The implementing legislation still has to be negotiated, and that will determine what happens with a teacher that doesn't pass a test. Up to now, on the basis not of the law but of an agreement between the union and the ministry, those teachers who failed didn't face any consequences. So what happens now, whether the law is going to force them out or to give them another chance, or a specific process for them to reassess their situation, whether there will be as with the alliance, and this is one of the things that was watered down in the law, where there will be compensation on the basis of merit based on the of standardized tests of children, meaning that if the teacher made any difference for a group being evaluated a year after they went into a yearly program. So the point is that the real clashes with the interest, special interest, with the vested interests that are opposing any change, who are bent and committed to the status quo, will those groups be forced to change? And that's true in energy, that's true in education, that's true in communications. In some cases it's a union, in some cases it's the owners of the company, in some cases it's a combination of both. So there are lots of things that may pass in the Congress and may not experience a change in reality, and it could happen the other way around. So that clash, that difference, that contrast between implementing and forcing a reform into reality, and the negotiation in the Congress is deep and lasting. In the case of education, the reform didn't take much in the Congress, but it will be an enormous battle in daily life if it comes about. In the case of communications, not surprisingly, since those are the owners are negotiating in the Senate and trying to get to water down what the objective was. Just the fact that the law was being negotiated led to a reduction in the price, so in the value of their stock of about 30% of the three incumbents. That simply tells you what the market believes might happen. What comes out of the Senate will tell whether they will be really affected or not, and those are things that are yet to be seen. Since each one of these entities is different, or each one of these sectors is different in its political dynamics, the process is different before and after.
I'm sure you'll hear from Carlos about this as well in a bit. So yes, this conversation will continue. Carlos Elizondo.
Thank you, Margaret Hayes. Luis, I always look forward to your books, especially enjoyed your book on Mexico, the middle class. You have, in glancing through your latest, you make reference to the challenge of decentralized government, to the implementing of reforms. And can you speak a little bit to the capacity of ministries at the federal level, at the different state level, and so forth to carry out the kind of reforms that are being envisaged?
Thanks, Margaret. I think that there are two possible answers to that. One is that if there were strong institutions, decentralization would be the way to go and the easiest way to go. In a country as diverse as Mexico in every sense of the way, and as decentralized as it has become, not only politically, but in the way that the different states work, that the different businesses operate, and so on, it is logical for it to be much more decentralized. However, if you look back, the only two eras in which the Mexican economy grew strongly were the two eras in which there was very strong political centralization. And that was the era of Porfirio Diaz at the end of the 19th century, and the 20 or 25 very good years of the pre-rule during the 1940s to the end of the 1960s. So the question is there a connection? Is there a correlation between centralization and success, or is that need not be? I think that the new administration believes that centralization is the core of everything. What the PRI does bring to the picture is a much more competent management and much more competent political management, together with the fact that there are the majority of the states today, more than half, are governed by the PRI, and the ability to discipline the governors and the like by the PRI is much greater. I'd say that it's closer to absolute against almost impossible for the PAN governments. So the ability of the government to use these levers of power to get things done is much greater. And that's what Peña has been exercising and has been using it very deftly. He is a man of power. He's a man who understands power and knows how to wield power, and he's been doing it for the last several years as governor. He built his candidacy from the ground up, and he did it very consciously from the minute he got the nomination to be a candidate for governorship. So he's been at this for many years. He built the relationships with all the candidates for governors in other states so that he'll get the proper financing for his campaign. The point is that he's built this network that would allow him to carry out reforms where he willing to do so. And in that sense is that I see an enormous opportunity. Mexico will not be a centralized, the old PRI will not be reproduced, it's impossible. But some of the features of the old PRI obviously are coming back, and the PRIistas will attempt to reproduce much of that. I don't believe it's possible. Simply the dynamic of the global economy and the internet and the like make it impossible. But the more competent administration would be welcome, and I think that that's an opportunity, and I see that as an opportunity. I don't see the government today. I hope I see them shortly, but I don't see the government today knowing what they are going to do with that capacity that they've built.
Oh, thank you, Richard Downey. Luis, following that line that you just mentioned and answering Margaret's question about Enrique Peña Nieto using the power that he has and being a man of power, I think perhaps that the symbolically this putting Elbester Gordillo in jail was certainly a representation of that power, of knowing how to do it and making it work. Why do you think that President Calderon couldn't or didn't do the same thing when he was trying to make the same kind of educational reforms that it wasn't possible? What's the difference in how that was able to be done, do you think, under Enrique Peña Nieto? Thank you.
I think that the calculations that Calderon made during his time had to do with the partnership that he assumed would be very important, very useful with the teachers' union for the elections, and he decided to cave in the reforms of education to the union. That's history. That's truthful. What his own personal considerations might have been, it's a matter of speculating. What he certainly didn't do is take advantage of the opportunity. In a way, what Salinas did in his time and what Peña has done in his time and what Calderon or Fox didn't do was to take advantage of symbolic events to turn things around. Just like Reagan used the controllers, the airline controllers strike to transform his own presidency, Salinas did so with the jailing of the Pemex workers union leader, as has Peña. But just like Salinas didn't use that to transform Pemex energy or anything else, the question today is, will Peña use this as the beginning of a transformation, whether it be in education or something else? I think, again, he has amassed power as a result and amassed credibility as a result, but what is he going to use it for? That's the big question. If what was obvious to me from the very first day of this administration, when he made the appointments to the cabinet, was that he had sent a very tough and very experienced politician to education, and he sent a very competent but not very experienced, or not somebody who's politically experienced, to Pemex. And the signal to the unions, to both of them, was absolute. One was there will be action. The other is there is nothing to be concerned about, and we've already seen that in both arenas. Now, will the president carry out big reforms in education, actually implement them? Will he do the same in energy? Those are questions that remain to be seen.
If we can take just one last question, then we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you.
Roger Candelaria, I want to thank you for a really interesting presentation, and especially the kind of warning that I think was explicit in Andrew's talk and implicit in Don Luis's talk, and about not getting caught up in what happens in Washington, but rather focus on what's really happening in Mexico. And I wonder, I'm having a little trouble getting my arms around what my friend Andrew said about the firearms. Coming from Colorado and spending a lot of time in New Mexico and the El Paso area with a lot of border there, I envision that even if the United States, either by citizens of the United States or people who are here in the United States or the U.S. Treasury, if we sent no guns at all into Mexico from the United States, that the drug money that already exists in Mexico, the cartels and so on, would have no trouble finding another source of supply. There are probably, I'm guessing, at least 100 countries in which firearms are manufactured around the world. The technology is not difficult. Any competent gunsmith can manufacture firearms in his garage or his shop. It seems to me that the much more relevant context would be the culture of violence that exists both in Mexico and the United States in different ways, and the market forces. If you want to get guns in almost any country and you have enough money, I don't think that we can corner the supply on firearms by withholding firearms from the United States. I'd like your comments.
I'd simply argue that, as I wrote in the security chapter, that the problem of Mexico is not one of guns or crime, but of lack of proper, modern, effective police forces and judiciary. In other words, of an institutional problem. If Mexico were to, if drugs didn't exist, Mexico would still have a serious organized crime problem. In fact, the first wave of serious crime that Mexico confronted after it began, after the very centralized and controlled political system began to unravel, was with pirated goods and with stolen vehicles and with auto parts theft and so on, and that simply showed the very weakness of Mexico's institutions, and I believe that that's the real problem. If Mexico strengthens that and resolves that serious problem, the issue of drugs and the issue of violence and crime would diminish. Maybe less guns or more difficult guns, more difficult access to a market of guns in the U.S. would help. But as you say, I think that what I understand is that the international market for guns, the illegal market for guns, is readily available. Many of those guns come from Panama, don't come from the U.S. How many, I have no idea, but the issue again is not one of guns specifically, but of institutions.
I would agree with Luis on that. Roger, good to see you, by the way. But I don't think stopping the flow of guns ends violence in Mexico. I mean, but there is, if you think about the framework for this, what the violence rising in Mexico is a combination of two things. One is it is a question of rule of law in Mexico and institutions in Mexico, but it also has to do with the consumption patterns in the United States of illegal narcotics and the money that we send back to Mexico. Whatever we can do, and some of that money goes back in the form of arms, whatever we can do to slow the flow of money and arms into Mexico won't stop violence. In fact, there's always the counterintuitive possibility that if you intercept more of the money and more of the weapons, you actually might have a spike in violence. I mean, in the short term. Long term probably goes down, but short term. But you certainly begin to make it more costly for organized crime to operate. Right now, it's not that they can't get weapons from other parts of the world. They certainly can, and they do. But it's just so easy to get it from the United States. It just lowers the cost immensely of investing in violence. And so one problem is, I mean, if you raise the cost of getting weapons, it raises their operating costs. But two is it's who gets weapons, which is it's incredibly easy for the B, C, and D level players in organized crime to get weapons right now. The A level players will always get weapons, and they will get them from somewhere. It may cost them more to try and get them from Asia or from Europe or somewhere else. But the cartels themselves, the organized crime groups, Chapo Guzman will get weapons one way or another. It may cost him more, it may cost him less. He will figure a way around even of money laundering, right? I mean, can do that. But the B, C, and D level players, which are the groups that support organized crime, are often the most violent parts of this. If you look at Juarez, if you look at Tijuana, if you look at Monterrey, a lot of the violence is actually not driven by the cartels themselves. It's driven by these other groups, these networks that are part of the organized crime family that are contracted for specific things. And for those cells right now, it's very easy to get weapons, particularly in the north of Mexico. If it were harder to get weapons across the border, those other groups, smaller groups that have much less money, would have much more trouble getting weapons, and you might actually see a drop in violence because of that. You're right. Is it a solution? No. But in fact, when you deal with organized crime, you deal with crime. There is no magic bullet. So the question is, how do you go at all the strategies? How do you go after money laundering? How do you go after consumption patterns? How do you go after guns? How do you build judicial institutions? How do you build police institutions? How do you build strengthen prosecutors? How do you invest in prevention? None of these are magic bullets. Hopefully you do all of them at the same time, and you get some sort of progress in bringing down violence.
Thank you very much to both our panelists, Luis.
Thank you.
We move straight on to the next panel. Carlos and Agustin, if you don't mind coming up.
So we'll take a break after the second panel, but we're going to move straight into this next panel.
Good. Yeah.
And congratulations, by the way. So thank you. Yeah, you got elected. We'll catch up after this.
Yeah, absolutely. I would ask you a favor, actually, curiously enough.
Oh, good. Oh, cool.
Hey.
Sorry about that.
Great. Very, very well. Thank you.
Congratulations. You got a full room.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the quality of the speakers, clearly.
Of course.
Water would be great, yeah, thanks. Gin's easier to hide, And vodka, you can't smell it on your breath, so I mean,
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much. Lovely. Thanks, Ashley. Well, without further ado, we move on to our second panel, the politics of structural reform. We have with us two excellent ponentes speakers, Diputado Agustin Barrios Gomez, who is a Mexican congressman from the Federal Chamber of Deputies, representing the PRD. I've known Agustin for a number of years in capacity as somebody who studied Canada. I mean, you spent a long time in Canada growing up. He's a true NAFTA citizen, having lived in Canada, the United States, and of course in Mexico. I went to Georgetown University, and in fact, it's interesting that you and I share that. Is that you have the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Switzerland. Well, I'm an Englishman who's lived in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So I guess we're unusual NAFTA citizens in that sense. But it's great to have you here. And also Carlos Elizondo, who I've known in an academic capacity for a number of years. And we've come across each other on television shows, I think, a couple of times. Carlos, as most of you know, has a very long association with the CIDE, which was my rival institution for many years in Mexico. I was in the at the ITAM, but Carlos was the Director General of CIDE for a number of years, and also went on to become Mexican ambassador to the OECD. He's a very, very well respected researcher. The panel is about structural reforms. The idea of having this mixture of people, somebody who is in the actual world of policy making, decision making, and somebody who has been there but is now an analyst, is to really get sort of two sides to the debate over what's happening in structural reform. Somebody who's intimately involved in the process of negotiating these things, and I expect that we'll hear a lot about the Pacto por México from Agustin, and somebody who can step back from the process and adopt a more academic, analytic perspective on it. So without further ado, Agustin, if you would like to launch into the theme.
Thanks, Duncan. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in DC. I'm sorry I was a little bit late, but I can share with you, I had the opportunity to meet an early morning meeting with Congressman Henry Cuellar of the border region. His district, it goes from Laredo to Brownsville and then up, and he's got about half of San Antonio. And he's on the Appropriations Committee. So it was very, very interesting to get his point of view. I met him a couple of times. He's a great friend of Mexico. Obviously, what happens in Mexico is very important to him. As you know, Laredo, Texas is the most important inland port in the United States, with over $80 billion worth of commerce flowing through there. We overtook the Detroit-Windsor area a few years ago. And that's just, it's par for the course, because, of course, it is the most cross-border in the world, legally, and it does represent about $350 billion worth of trade. The largest physical port for people actually crossing is San Isidro, and that's sort of a little bit of a mess. But in general, it's going from 23 to 60 lanes of traffic, which is hard to fathom. But it does tell you about what the reality is. I find the border fascinating. Also, the people from NADBank, from the North American Development Bank, arrived at Congressman Cuellar's office, and I was able to talk to them. And even though it's starting from a very low base, the North American Development Bank has multiplied its ability to lend, and they are expanding its remit to border infrastructure projects. So that's another good piece of news that I actually was unaware of until this morning, but I can share with you today that it's very, very exciting. These guys, they come from a banking background, they don't come from a political background, and I think that could help a lot. It's great to see Lázaro Cárdenas here. I find it very funny that perhaps the most inward-looking party, which is the PRD, it seems to be most represented at this panel. Just in very general terms, and I think this kind of illustrates what we were talking about. I want to open with a taste of what's going on in the outside world to make a very basic point about our binational friendship and the reason that it behooves us to understand each other better. Just one last distinction, sorry, but I found this quite interesting because speaking with the congressman this morning, sorry to come back to this, but I just saw that note in my speech. There is this obsession with border security, right? And we were talking about this. Congressman Cuellar gets very frustrated because the U.S. side of the border is actually very, very safe. El Paso, whatever, is actually the fourth safest city in the United States. So the U.S. side of the border actually is the safest it's been for God knows how long. There's no major incidents when you consider the size of the population, statistically speaking. But there's a big distinction, and I think that we get lost in this distinction. Most people don't quite make the logical leap. The border on this side is actually very safe. But that does not mean that there isn't a presence of organized crime, Mexican organized crime, in the border states. There's a difference. So it's safe, but they're not shooting each other up like they are on the other side, right? And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because otherwise we get lost in all of this, all of the claptrap about the border. So to gain some perspective, just get some basic things out of the way. Our military is not going to hack your computers. We're not going to invade the Senkakus, or for that matter, ask you to defend them for us. We do have nuclear technology, and we have a lot more money than North Korea. But there's no way that we're going to try to build a nuclear weapon. In fact, I think it's very encouraging that the Non-Proliferation Pact for the Americas is actually named after a Mexico City neighborhood, which is Tlatelolco. Also, one of the things that Luis was saying, and backed up by Andrew, with respect to our trade relationship, not all U.S. imports are created equal. For every dollar that the United States imports from Mexico, fully 30 to 60 cents, depending on how you calculate it, is actually pumped back into the United States via U.S.-made components. That figure for China is about 3 cents. So, when you're discussing, mutually beneficial relationships, apart from the fact that we don't have a hidden agenda, or at least I'm not privy to having heard of one, unlike other countries that consider themselves rising powers with actually huge chips on their shoulder, we don't have that, and I think that that's a great benefit. So beyond that, you can actually look at the math, and the math also speaks very highly of the mutually beneficial aspect of the relationship. Most of the world is hostile, it's nihilistic, and it's mean. It's a zero-sum game world, and Mexico, in general, on the other hand, shares the U.S.'s win-win mentality, just in general. And I think that that's something that deserves more attention, even beyond the fact that we now share democratic values. We are certainly, Mexico is actually a very free country. In many ways, it's a little bit too free. And that speaks to the weakness of the institutions, but it also speaks to the ethos of the Mexican people. Mexican people tend to be live and let live types. So we are like that. So we do come in peace, and our ability as partners to deal with the world successfully in the 21st century will, to a large degree, and I'm including both countries, if not all three countries, will depend on our ability to work as a team right here in North America. Our two countries, for all practical purposes, have already integrated beyond the scope of any two large countries anywhere, and our governments are still trying to catch up with that reality. So, of course, change in Mexico will impact the United States. It was very funny. I was talking to a person from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. They're actually building a huge compound, a huge new office center in my district. And that's coming up within the next couple of years. And one of the people there, she said, I've been to every country that considers itself a special relationship, right? Israel, the UK, Canada, and when they talk about their being the most important country in the world for the United States, they have no idea. They haven't come to Mexico. This is huge, and Mexico City is the only place outside of Washington D.C. where every U.S. single government dependency is represented. And if it weren't for the wars, we would be actually we would have the largest mission in Mexico City, and of course the largest consular presence by order of magnitude on the planet is Mexico's presence in the United States with 50 consulates. So what does so anyway, I did want to give you that background because of course that's kind of my spiel. What does this mean for structural reform? So if you ask some of the members of my party, it's sort of the last nail in the coffin for Mexico, right? A coup de grace for neoliberalism. If you ask the proponents of reform, which actually does include a moderate majority within the PRD, it's about making the tough making the tough decisions that have been postponed for far too long. So in the last 6 months, we've passed labor, education, and telecoms reform with overwhelming majorities. And yes, there is a lot of horse trading going on in the Senate with respect to telecommunications, but if they change it, it's coming back to us. And so the whole checks and balances thing, even within the two chambers of Congress, is quite real. So if we get it back and we don't like it, then it's not gonna move forward. As for energy and fiscal reform, they're the ones that are next. And I think that those are going to be more difficult because there's less of a consensus among the general population. It's too easy for nationalist populists to paint energy reform as a form of stealth privatization. And if fiscal reform turns out to be all about raising taxes, which is sort of what you hear, specifically by extending our 16% value-added tax to food and medicine, well, no voter in the world likes that, right? Nevertheless, there's something to be said for momentum, and there's certainly that. The makeup of our 62nd Congress, we have had 61 Congresses before, out of a total of 500 representatives, about 134 of us come from the left, including the PRD, Movimiento Ciudadano, and the PT, or the so-called Workers' Party. And that means that constitutional changes do not actually require the approval of our group. But, you know, up until now, the reforms have actually gotten it, or at least the large majority of it. God is going to be very much in the details if congressmen and women on the left are going to have enough cover to vote in favor of something that could very easily be turned against us by our core constituency. Just last Tuesday, a large majority of us voted against a proposed blueprint for an energy strategy precisely because of this. And even though it didn't have a direct impact, it's probably a harbinger of things to come. It was passed by the majority within the House, but opposition on the left could very well be a sign of things to come, like I just mentioned. So even without the imposing presence of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as most of you know, he left to found his own party, which he hopes to do by 2015, thereby probably significantly affecting the possibility of there being a president from the Social Democrat area of the country within the foreseeable future. But anyway, that's just my interpretation. There is a large minority within these three parties on the left that sees practically any change as anathema to the interests of the nation, and that's just the reality. About 12% of the population in Mexico, and I'm saying this as an analyst and not as a congressman, but about 12% of the population in Mexico is just very angry, and they see things, they see pretty much all change as negative. They are very circumspect, and that is the 12% that you see on the streets pretty much constantly. So the change that would impact the United States the most would be if Mexico were to break free from its lackadaisical 3 to 4% growth band and start growing at the 5 to 7% that we need to absorb our expanding workforce. As a product of the demographic explosion of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we have a so-called demographic dividend with a large working age population vis-a-vis a small dependent population of children and the elderly. Nevertheless, after more than 30 years of relative economic stagnation, stability, however you want to look at it, this bulge in our demographic pyramid has expanded the ranks of organized crime and migration to the United States even more than it has the workforce, which is, I mean, one of the reasons why we're seeing this is basically because there are a lot of males between the ages of 18 and 34, and statistically they're the ones that are most apt to become criminals if they see if they have their expectations limited, which is the truth. I mean, this is, at the end of the day, this is a lower middle class, upper lower class urban phenomenon. These people actually have about 8 to 9 years worth of schooling. They generally have their basic needs met in terms of nutrition and in terms of healthcare, so they can worry about becoming very, very wealthy very, very quickly, and that's what's going on. So we still have a window of opportunity to turn this around, but time is running short. So even more than structural reform, the one thing that would turn Mexico into a true powerhouse and a consolidated power in North America is public security, and this, coming to Luis's point, is the powerful government institutions. We need nation building. When there was control of the government, the public security apparatus within the country was actually designed more for political control, which had the collateral benefit of territorial control, but at the end of the day, it was not a modern working institutional framework in order to implement proper public security strategies. And bringing the army in before preparing it for all of this was obviously not I mean, I understand why President Calderon did it, but it was sort of it was a rash decision by any stretch of the imagination. So. Even though that actually might prove harder than getting the PRD to vote for private investment in the oil sector, it is this one thing that is the holy grail of Mexican development in the early part of this century. And I think that American know-how and technology can help us achieve this. I think that the Merida initiative was an interesting start, but its focus on the funding became a little bit of a red herring, in my view. I mean, at the end of the day, Mexico is the world's 13th largest economy. We approved about a federal budget of $400 billion. Money's not the problem. We have money. What we need is a plan, and we need the necessary human and technological resources to implement it properly. That's what we really need. So I kind of want to get away from this. Oh, did we approve? Speaking from an American side, did we approve $1.3 billion, and is that money being well spent, and all of that? That's beside the point. We've got bigger fish to fry. This is a very important issue for both countries, and Mexico has been very effective in protecting American interests. There's a reason why we don't have major international incidents along the border, and that reason is that Mexico has been very effective at keeping the major bad guys out, and we do this every day. And I don't think we get enough credit for that. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to convey to my American partners here in Congress. As you know, there's no re-election in Mexico, which makes it very difficult because obviously I've got 3 years, and that's not a long time.
2 years and a half.
Yeah, now 2 years and a half. Yeah, don't remind me. So Duncan, if you have a position here. But unlike our counterparts, I mean, it was great to be in an office of a congressman this morning who has been in office for 9 years or something like that. I mean, this guy, he knows his stuff, right? He's finally on the appropriations committee, and he's doing well, and he's doing his job, and he has the time to do his job. And yes, he does have to check back with his constituents, but as long as he keeps on the bad end, bringing home the bacon, or on the good end, as long as he keeps up being a very professional legislator, he's going to be able to keep his job. So we need to move forward. We need to be very quick. We need American human and technological resources. I believe that's very, very necessary. I think we need to cooperate much more on that end. I also think that we are missing the opportunity to take advantage of a huge resource, which is the Mexican American population. The Mexican American population has affected or participated in the relationship only insofar as they make up such a large part of the border communities. But in reality, we need to start integrating these people more. I mean, as you know, CBP officers, Homeland Security, and the Army, the largest or the fastest growing minority is. I'm going to get away from the whole Latino Hispanic thing because that's a whole different kettle of fish. The largest minority within the Latino thing and Hispanic and within the general group are Mexican Americans. The general that invaded Iraq is General Sanchez from South Texas, and he was a Mexican American, or he is a Mexican American. So I think we need to pull more of these people who know the problem on the border better than most, and I think that is a resource that we would do very well to look towards, and that's something that I'm hoping to highlight between both groups. All right.
Many thanks, Agustin. We're going to move straight ahead with Carlos. Carlos?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, SIDAC and the Woodrow Wilson Center for having me here to this very interesting day called Mexico Today. And I appreciate a lot to share the table with Diputado Barrios Gomez. But he has to bear in mind that at the end of his trip, I'm going to ask him, and what did Miguel Hidalgo win from having you here? Why? Because he's my deputy. I'm from Miguel Hidalgo. Although I suspect that after his remark on no re-election, maybe I won't have an answer.
Exactly.
Because of the lack of re-election. But I'm very glad to have you as a partner here. I'm very glad as well that I wasn't invited here 7 months ago, because I would have predicted that Peña would win by a large margin of maneuver. And if someone would have challenged me and would have told me those polls are wrong, he's going to win by a small margin of maneuver, then we would have probably returned to what all our political science would have argued. With gobierno dividido, with divided government, Peña Nieto would be incapable of doing anything. And no, I would have been twice wrong. He won by a small margin, as was already explained by the deputy. I mean, the advantage is not so big. And second, he has been capable of doing what seemed impossible, to govern Mexico with a divided government. So first, why? It's important to bear in mind that finally, after Salinas perhaps, we again have a man of power, a politician that understands well which are the springs of power. He has not only the advantage of having the PRI as a disciplined party, but the PRI learned from its time in the opposition how important discipline was. Thirdly, if the PRI is disciplined, the PRI of the state of Mexico is even more disciplined. I mean, as Luis said, their model is President López Mateos, but their way of thinking politically is exactly as López Mateos. I mean, the state of Mexico is still like old-style priismo, and he has the advantage of this very large state with a lot of power, and he put people within all the ministries as second-level undersecretaries, the guys that run the show at the state of Mexico. The largest group, if we don't count them as parties, are the priistas of the Estado de Mexico in the Chamber of Deputies, around 50, that have a very strong position within the PRI. It's also worth in mind two other things, that the opposition is divided. Not only he has to deal with two opposition parties, but within each of these parties, there are very acute divisions, and President Peña has been able to use that into his advantage. He also profits from the fact that since '97, we were accustomed to have as leader of the opposition in Mexico, the chief of Mexico City, first Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, then López Obrador, then Marcelo Ebrard, for a variety of reasons which I won't explain right now. Miguel Ángel Mancera, in spite of having had the largest majority imaginable when elected a few months ago, he's not playing that role. But two other things I want to underscore that are important to understand why so far Peña Nieto has been so successful through the Pacto for Mexico to reconstruct the relationship with the two opposition parties and manage to move forward a very ambitious agenda of reform. And it has to do first with the fact that he's the first president from the PRI that has democratic legitimacy. I think that explains, among other things, his capacity to deal with the more old guard priistas. He's less vulnerable to the kind of things other priista presidents were. And secondly, since Luis Echeverría arrived to power, all presidents of the PRI had to spend their first year or their whole sexenio managing the macroeconomic crisis that had been inherited by his predecessor. He has the advantage of arriving to a macroeconomically stable situation. It's worth remembering a joke that's circulating 18 years ago, more or less precisely, when President Zedillo was confronting the last major economic crisis we had to confront. I'll say it in Spanish. ¿En qué se parecen, decíamos entonces, el presidente Zedillo y la Semana Santa? Que nunca se sabía cuándo iban a caer.
Si caen en marzo o en abril.
Si caen en marzo o en abril. I mean, Semana Santa, you never know which day it's going to actually take place. So we thought that then, of course, it didn't work that way, or some people thought that it didn't work that way. But the fact is that he inherited a relatively stable, economically speaking and politically speaking situation. He has the security problem, which will be discussed by Edna and Aline in a moment. But the fact is his starting point is very strong. And it's also it's worth having in mind that the current Mexican worship, as it was said a moment ago, compared to Brazil, started before Peña Nieto arrived to power. If you look at the media, the positive expectations around Mexico started in May, June, July. Why? Because first, Brazil's model was not working as expected, a lot of our current optimism is in a way a contrast with Brazil and with Brazil only, because we are growing less than 3 years ago. The problem for Brazil is they were growing 7% a couple of years ago, and now they're growing 1%. So we're still growing around 4, but 4 versus 7 is not very nice. 4 against 1 seems to be very, very successful. So there's part of the current optimism with respect to Mexico that started before and has to do a lot with the things that Luis said a moment ago, which has to be with the fact that NAFTA impact grew upon time. There's this very interesting work by Ricardo Hausmann and others, which is called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And what they try to show is that a country is potential depends a lot on their capacity to create links with the rest of the world. And the Mexican situation in that sense is extremely positive, because the complexity of the Mexican economy after 25 years of NAFTA is such that its capacity to link with the rest of the world and create critical mass is much higher, not than Brazil, which is number 60 whatever, but it's larger than even China, because as a percentage of our GDP, exports and imports are extremely important. So the fact that we created that density in a way is now helps explaining what are the most successful part of the Mexican economy, which is of course our export sector, and in particularly our automobile industry. And also, precisely because of the weakness of the PAN, they weren't able to do the reforms they might have wanted, but they didn't have either the power to make mistakes. I mean, perhaps because ideologically they believed on not spending more in the 2009 crisis, as many people suggested. The fact is that they resisted the temptation, as Brazil did not, to spend more after the 2009 crisis and to increase protectionism. But in fact, after the crisis, the President Calderon continued to diminish tariffs outside of the NAFTA area, which were on average still very high, resisting the pressure of the more protectionist firms in Mexico. So that's as a background. So now the truth is that thanks to his political capacity, we have the Pacto for Mexico. Agustin has already told us very quickly which are the main reforms that have already taken place. I'll stick to 2 of them. I'll stick first to a couple of reforms which are usually not taken into consideration, but I mean very important, which has to do with one of the things that Agustin said, which is strengthening institutions. One of the things that the Pacto has helped to do is moved into an agenda that was long delayed in many areas that might increase the capacity of the Mexican state to regulate basic issues. Some examples. There was this major reform, which I think is much more important than the telecommunications reform, and I'll go back into that, a change in the Ley de Amparo, the writ of amparo, which, as you are probably aware, made it possible for, no matter how nice laws we had, never to be implemented. When I was ambassador to the OECD, I really didn't understand why had they accepted us to the OECD, to be frank. So I tried to understand the debate when we were accepted. And of course, all these great Salinas Dream Team went and explained how well they were doing. They changed the laws exactly as the OECD was demanding. What no one thought is that the law wouldn't be implemented, and in part because of the Juicio de Amparo. If you look at the capacity Mexican firms or any people with strong with resources and strong connections have to protect themselves from the rule of law through a legal instrument called Juicio de Amparo, the capacity to maintain at bay the regulatory capacities of the state were very large. We know well the story in telecommunications. Normal decision of the COFETEL would be debated by Telmex, and after 10 years of suspension, they might win or lose. Who cares? After 10 years of profiting from your dominant position, you had gained a lot of money. So this reform on the Ley de Amparo, it's important. Might have created some excesses. It's a classical pendulum movement where it's true that big firms profited from that suspension the new reform that impedes suspension in areas linked to concessions might be too harsh because it might leave them unprotected, but in terms of strengthening the state, it certainly moved in the correct direction. And the same has to be said, for example, in this new law, the Contabilidad General, which will allow us to know, I hope, it depends how it's implemented, but in principle, it would allow us to know much better how state spends money. They are currently discussing in the Senate and will return to the Chamber of Deputies, will go to the Chamber of Deputies, this law with respect to how to regulate better debts at the local level, which ballooned in the second half of the Calderon's administration. So that, I think, are in itself interesting improvements. We'll probably see this new Commission Anti-Corruption being decided in the next months or weeks, which might work well. So those things, I think, are positive. But of course, what has captured the eyes of the media are not these reforms, but are these major structural reforms, education, and telecommunications. There, I am less optimistic. And I'll explain you why. They go, of course, in the correct direction, but for at least two reasons, I think that we're using a very complex mechanism to achieve our objective. Let me explain me quicker with the telecommunication reform. Of course, we needed to create competition. Of course, it was something that had to be done quickly. But because of the logic of the pacto, which, as Agustin very briefly said, it's in fact, the pacto is not needed because neither the PAN nor the left have enough power to blockade a constitutional reform. So in principle, you needed only one of the two major opposition parties to do constitutional reforms. Salinas had a similar dilemma, and he decided to work only with the PAN. You might remember what Salinas said about the left. Ni los oigo, ni los veo, ni les hablo. Like those Thailand monkeys you might know, no? He just didn't care about them. It had its cost, but in terms of pushing the agenda, it worked much more in a much more compact and efficient way. Why? Because by putting the left and the right negotiating complex technical issues, you end adding their demands that might be contradictory. And in fact, in the telecommunications reform, what we have is at the same time the important change of strengthening the capacity of the state to regulate the sector with the vision of the left, let's have our own state company to do that directly. So if you look at the telecommunication reform, it will be creating a new paraestatal in charge of managing the backbone currently on the ownership of la Comisión Federal de Electricidad, and they, as far as I can understand, will also be responsible of managing all the extra wavelength that will be given back to the government as a result of the analogical shutdown. So those 700 megahertz band will be managed by this institution. So in a way, it's going to have a big impact in the sector, but is that really the best strategy to promote private investment? Is private investment going to be competing with this paraestatal funded by the government with subsidies? The band will be given for free. So that creates a tension with respect to what I think matters more from this kind of reforms, which is how quickly it translates into more investment, lower prices, better access. And I think that not only because of this tension between the more statist view of the world and the more regulatory part of it, but because of the nature of the regulatory reform, which is an extremely cumbersome and long route they decided. If you look at what was needed, in my reading, you didn't need a constitutional reform. You only needed to change a few laws and have more political capacity to implement them. By moving the Constitution, putting into the Constitution the most ridiculous details, the telecommunication constitutional reform has more words than the US Constitution. Just that reform. And it goes into the more minute details, or as for example, according to one of the transitories of the constitutional reform, you will decide that a firm is predominant based on an arithmetic criteria, 50% of the market. it's a not very orthodox, to say the least, mechanism for determining which firm is predominant. If you were Telmex or America Mobile with that criteria, how much would you invest in the next years? Not much, because you are well beyond the 50%. You might argue the smaller ones will invest, not necessarily. First, because there's a lot of uncertainty on what does that actually mean, and I'll go back to that in a moment. But secondly, as well, because if one of the consequences of being larger than 50% is that you'll have to open your network and give it at cheap prices to your competition. Why invest if you can use Telmex networks at a cheap price? In fact, the unbundling of the, how do you say it in English, del bucle, the whole idea of opening the network, which was very popular in the OECD 10, 15 years ago, is now questioned, because it hasn't promoted investment, because if you pressure people to give the network very cheap, who is going to invest in the network? And secondly, because it's going to take a lot of time for this reform to be implemented. You have to change the constitution, which we are currently doing. Then you have to change two laws, mixed fusion, two laws, the law of telecommunication of the law of television and radio, into one single legal body, which is technically very complex. Then you have to refound two major bodies, which will be constitutionally autonomous, the Instituto Federal de Telecomunicaciones y la new COFECO. Then you have to nominate and approve the nomination of their members, all the regulations, manuales de procedimiento, even though the Constitution states in the transitory articles that it will take 180 days this measure, 120 this other. We know that it's either they'll do it quickly and bad, or it will take more time. So through that long period of actually landing this reform, the capacity to impact the sector is going to be much lower than expected. Something similar with educational reform. Luis already said something about that. So in general, I think that the intentions are there, but precisely because the main logic behind the reforms, as Luis said, is political, and they're not so worried about policy. Or to put it slightly different, President Peña is very good at politics, but he's less worried about policy details. He wants the reform ready the 1st of May, and he doesn't care so much about the details, because that's not where his strengths are. And the result is, I think, we're ending with very difficult to implement reforms. So moving forward, we have the most complex reforms still pending. We have some minor but not insignificant reforms that might appear in the next few weeks, like a financial reform. I hope it doesn't have this statist flavor we saw in the telecommunication reform. There are some pressures there in trying to move our Banca de Desarrollo a little bit like the Brazilian ones, which we now know wasn't such a good idea. Let's see what happens, but we'll be seeing that probably in the next 15 days. It's one of the sectors that has worked relatively well, although, of course, credit should grow quicker, but I wouldn't say it's a disaster. We have two other major reform pendings, which are energy and fiscal. It is for me quite interesting that the left, as Deputy Barrios Gomez told us, was unprepared to approve La Estrategia Nacional de Energía. I don't know if anyone here read the Estrategia Nacional de Energía, but it was basically an inertial strategy. They didn't want to introduce any of the reforms within the strategy to avoid conflict, and without changing anything, it wasn't approved by the left. The Estrategia Nacional de Energía accepted the basic petrochemical would be reserved for the government. Not even that was changed in La Estrategia Nacional de Energía. Completely inertial, and still the left didn't approve it.
I abstain.
He abstained. Well, I'm glad to know for Miguel Hidalgo. Thank you.
Representing your interests.
So I think that there it's going to be an extremely difficult reform. It's very complex for the PRD to be behind it, especially with López Obrador moving so clear, having saved all his bullets for this battle and touching an item that is very symbolic for Mexicans. Because the two reforms that have already been passed are very popular within Mexicans. 80% of Mexicans want a telecommunication reform. Only 20% of Mexicans would like Pemex to be open. So the game is very different in the energy reform. Ingeniero Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas has presented the left's, or one of the left's possible strategy within the energy sector, which, with all respect to Ingeniero, is just giving more power to Pemex, giving them more money, but it's not a real reform. For me, a reform is something that changes the structure of the energy sector, something, the best scenario possible, something like what Cardoso did with Petrobras in '97, really opening for competition, allowing everyone to participate in any sector. Of course, Petrobras was so strong and large that it still commands 80 or more % of the relevant markets, but still competition, while it lasted, helped Petrobras a lot to become a very strong firm. Now Petrobras is facing a regulatory framework in pre-salt that is closer to what we have in Mexico, and the results are there. They aren't performing as expected. So I think this reform is going to be very difficult. I don't even sure that within the PRI they have a real ambition, and they might claim, well, the left doesn't allow us, but I don't see them with a vision of really opening the sector by trying to move slowly in a way that will allow them to control the extraction of the rents. I think maybe they will allow Pemex to link with firms to exploit oil, but they will control that process in order to avoid a more market mechanism that wouldn't allow them to control the mechanism as I think they want in a sector that, as Luis said, they send a clear signal. Who is directing Pemex is not the strong, heavyweight politician needed for a complex reform. And very quickly, because my time is moving, it's almost finished, or perhaps it's already ended. Fiscal reform. Few words on fiscal reform. I'm always surprised that economic analysts argue that this is one of the reforms that is needed in order for Mexico to grow more. Depends how much and how you do the reform, and more importantly, how you spend those resources. Because in the case of Mexico, in the last 6 years, we had the equivalent of a fiscal reform, which is called higher oil prices and higher revenue. 3 points of GDP is the difference between what the revenue of the government in the Fox administration on average versus the Calderon administration on average, and that money wasn't used in such a way to detonate growth. So there I'm a little bit cautious. My view is that it's very unlikely, for political reasons that were very quickly said by Agustin, to see VAT, a general VAT, single rate. They probably move to something that will combine small reform in VAT just to change that current situation, but not really moving to a general 1, 2, 3% instead of 16, which would be the aim. Something on the income tax, raising perhaps the rates for persons, which compared to the US are lower, although the highest one kicks in much quicker. So I don't envisage like a major transformation here, although the pressures for spending in all the Peña Nieto's program and in just the inertia of people, pensions, etc., is there. So I won't dwell into the details because my time is over. I will just point out 3 risks which I have Peña Nieto might be facing in the next months or years, which will impact the actual capacity of this administration to finish, to have a longer-term impact in the Mexican society. First, which will be dealt in the next panel, security is by far not solved. It's yet to be seen how do they try to do that, and that might come out with a vengeance. It's easy to say I won't speak about security problems, but if you have a Casino Royale, no matter how much you don't speak about security, the problem is there. 3 days ago, they presented their numbers showing that they were going down. That same day, 15 persons were killed in Michoacán after they had gone to ask for security with the Secretario del Interior of the state of Michoacán, massacred by one of the cartels. So if the reality is there, no matter how much you try to change the perception, if the reality continues there, at the end it won't change the perception. Secondly, if I'm right and the economy doesn't grow much more as a result of what we've done so far in terms of reform, that's going to create a pressure within the administration, which, if we look at Lula or Dilma, this idea that each time you have an economic problem, you try to deal it through political instruments and not through market instruments, that's where we'll see the first dilemma of what is the real project of this administration. And lastly, it depends, the fiscal trajectory in Mexico depends a lot on the price and the production of oil. The price is still in historic heights. There seems to be some pressure for the price, some tendency for the prices to go down. I'm not sure, of course. It will depend what is the actual trajectory. And also, the current level of production of Pemex is by no way assured. We've managed to maintain that 2.5 million barrels per day, but it's the big investments in Chincontepec haven't yet created and the expansion of the production and what was expected. And by the mere fact the economy is growing slightly more than on average than in the past, it's creating a pressure for domestic consumption, which is making the exportable level lower than in the past. But I'll stop here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Carlos, so much. Before we move on to the questions, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Eduardo Medina Mora. Muchísimas gracias, embajador, por estar aquí con nosotros en su casa. The presentations, as you recognize, were incredibly dense and full of information. I imagine there's going to be a plethora of questions from the audience. I'd just like to put one thing out there, and please don't answer it right now, but incorporate into your answers from the other questions if you don't mind. And how great is the risk that the debates over fiscal, and in particular energy reform, will break the pacto apart? And, in what sense does that fit in with the scheduling of the reforms? Because I think that that's always been one of the questions that has fascinated me, that you began with labor, education, telecoms, and then energy and fiscal, whereas some analysts, a year ago were saying, you got to lead off with the big one so you get those out of the way. Is it a calculation of the honeymoon period lasting about 12 months and then real problems will emerge? Or is it that energy and fiscal will actually break the pacto apart, and so you need to get the other things done first of all before you do those? Questions from the floor, please. Gosh, so many. Okay, please start here. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jose Lobo. I'm a Georgetown University student. First of all, it's very nice to see Agustin. Agustin and I did a master's degree in Spain like 9 years ago, and haven't seen you since then. So nice to see you. You both mentioned the Pacto por México. But I was wondering if you can elaborate a little more on that, because a lot of people are talking about it like it is a great idea, and even the Washington Post recently in an editorial put it as a possible example to surpass the gridlock that is happening here in the United States. But others mention that it harms democracy because it can be an example of a democratic majority because it's composed of only a very few people, some of them not even in office, so and in Congress. So and as you know, well, Mexico has no re-election, and so don't you think that to improve our democracy, wouldn't it be better to have a major political reform that includes re-election, and that we know that the president has mentioned that he opposed, and or do you think that we first need a social and economic base to achieve those kind of reforms?
Thank you. I'm going to take another question over here. We'll take 3 questions. If that's okay with you guys? Put them together. Joe?
Joe Dukert. I'm a longtime independent analyst of energy and environmental policy in North America. And my question is addressed to the congressman, since he is a Georgetown graduate and who has lived in Canada, the United States, and Mexico for a long time. I have tried to push the idea of an interparliamentary meeting among legislators from all 3 countries. As you know, the U.S. meets with Mexico, the U.S. meets with Canada, Canada meets with Mexico. There has never, amazingly, been a meeting, or much less a series of meetings among the legislators. I've just about given up on the idea. First of all, because legislators in each of the 3 countries express reasons why they think there's too much of a difference in the various relationships. But I'd like to try one more time and see whether or not you think, A, it's possible, and B, whether or not it might help people in the United States recognize that Mexico matters because it's an important part of North America.
Thank you, Joe. And one last, yes, we take this one here. Yeah, thanks. Please.
Hi, my name is Jean Thève. I might be a little bit out of focus, I'm sorry, but I'm representing here the French National Center for Scientific Research in Canada, United States, and Mexico. There is, you've been speaking a lot about the economy. And in my opinion, there is still a reform that is slowly ongoing, might go further, maybe, in Mexico, which is all the R&D sector. So I have two questions. One is the last month's new nominations in the R&D sector in Mexico. Is it going the good way and the rise in the budget for this year? Because you were speaking about Brazil, for example. Brazil has risen extremely high, the R&D budget the last 10 years and went up to 1%. In Mexico, it's still less than 0.5. The second one, speaking about R&D and innovation sector, is Mexico still too much dependent, speaking about high technology companies, on foreign companies and foreign investments?
Thank you.
I don't understand the last question.
Is Mexico not too much dependent still now on foreign investments in high technology companies?
Please.
I think the last question is much more appropriate for Carlos, but I'll start with the other two. Okay, so the risk that the pacto will break apart. The pacto's demise has been basically predicted since the beginning. Whether it was a democratic mechanism within my party, it certainly was not. Most of my fellow congressmen and women were actually very angry at the fact that the president of our party, Jesus Zambrano, did not even forget about consulting us. He didn't even tell us. Given the fact that we're supposed to vote on these things, it was probably not the best thing. But I understand why he didn't tell us. It was sort of a way to preempt a lot of this stuff, and I think that this plays into the question about what does the fact that we don't have re-election mean? What it means is that there is a significant amount of power concentrated in the political parties, because obviously at the end of 3 years, I could have been Carlos's best representative in Congress or his worst. The outcome is the same. I don't have a job. And so the people after this, after their stint in Congress or the Senate or whatever, or even as mayors, which are also 3 years, believe it or not, not as governors, which are 6. The outcome is the same. You still owe your future job to the party leadership. So no re-election means two things. One, it means that the bureaucracy, or in a bad way, or the technocracy, or the executive branch becomes more powerful because they are the professionals. At the end of the day, by its very nature, we are novices at what we do within the legislature. And it also means this large increase in the power of the parties. And so is that democratic or not? Well, it can be argued both ways. Is the electoral system through the Electoral College in the United States democratic? I think it's a deficit in democracy. But at the end of the day, it was what the Founding Fathers decided on, and there seems to be a consensus that, what they were thinking was pretty smart. So for us, we do have the bugbear. We have the bête noire. We have the historical ghost of re-election, and unfortunately, from my point of view, it still bears very heavily, and my party's actually at the leading edge of being against it, and the Priistas are also, they still, and it keeps the blood moving sometimes. It does sort of ventilate the system, I guess, if you want to look at it from a good way. And just as a footnote, as an analyst, I can tell you, thinking about this even from my Georgetown days, 3 times 3 years for congressmen, 2 times 5 years for senators, and 2 times 5 years for presidents. That's my observation as an analyst, not as a congressman. In terms of democratic or interparliamentary, do you want me to go into the interparliamentary stuff? I'm a big believer in interparliamentary meetings. The question is, what do we do about the Canadians? What does one do with Canada? Well, the problem is that we are actually in favor of it, and we have friendship groups, and we have a lot of, and I personally plan to come up to DC very, very, very often, because obviously this is my passion. But the Canadians, they want to keep things separate because they don't want to have their relationship so quote unquote contaminated by Mexican participation, because they believe that the issues are significantly different. Anybody who's actually studied the matter and who's spoken to intelligent Canadians knows that this is simply not the case, and we bring a lot to the table. And in fact, if we were to decide which relationship is more important, I would actually argue that Mexico's relationship is order of magnitude more important than the Canadian relationship. Whether it's more complicated, yeah, that's another issue. But 31 million Mexican Americans, that's basically the population of Canada. I'd love to bring all three countries to the table, but we need a consensus with respect to that. Now, parliamentarians are, by our very nature, often navel-gazing, right? We play to our local constituents. And so I think that the Canadians in Parliament and the Americans in Congress that don't share this vision, it's because, how does that get me more votes or more financing for my campaign in the case of the United States? So I am pushing for that, and we can talk about that afterwards. There are a lot of very, very intelligent, very well-versed, very well-spoken companions in the Mexican Congress. A lot from Monterrey, like Pepe is from, or my wife is also from Monterrey. And they know what they're talking about, and I think this could be a good opportunity. Eloy Cantú, for example. And obviously we would very much enjoy the participation and the help of Ambassador Medina Mora. No? So that's my 2 cents.
First, your question, Duncan. I think, just like you, that the idea originally, as far as I know, was move quickly with the most complex one. After they got the electoral results and they start feeling that the reaction of the Yo Soy 132, López Obrador, etc., the Monex, etc., they thought it would last longer, and they wanted to put the left into the table, and then they decided to move with a pacto, profiting from the fact that the PAN was divided, the PRD as well, what I said very briefly. But everyone knows, I think, that it's just an instrument. It's not an objective in itself. And therefore, they started with the things where there were more consensus. They've moved in many other things that don't even go through legislation relatively well. In fact, in the two most difficult areas, energy and fiscal reform, there's basically nothing in the pacto. The only thing you can get from the pacto is that el petróleo será nuestro, is the only thing you really get. And secondly, that fiscal consolidation will be eliminated. It's the only things you can get from the pacto. So they're well aware that when they reach that moment, the pacto might break, and then they'll have to decide what type of coalition they want to construct. Bear in mind that for fiscal reform, even though the PRI doesn't have a majority in the Senate, not being a constitutional one, it's relatively easy to get the 11 votes if you work hard. So you could manage to do some of these things by yourself in the case of the PRI. For energy reform, of course, contrary to telecommunication reform, where I think constitutional reform was not needed, in energy, it's a mandatory. Without a major energy reform, constitutional reform, the energy reform is just useless. And I fear that we might be moving like in the US with respect to gun controls. I think that oil is for Mexico what gun controls are for the United States. From the outside, it's very difficult to understand. Why can they fight so much about registering people that buy automatic guns? From the outside, it's ridiculous. From the outside, maybe some of the positions of the left not allowing basic petrochemical to be taken out of the Constitution is ridiculous, because it has destroyed our petrochemical industry and many other things, shale gas, etc. But it's a matter of principle, political principle, ideological principle, and that's what makes these debates extremely difficult. With respect to the democracy thing, question you ask, it's true. In fact, I was going to make a joke to Agustin that, in fact, it doesn't matter so much what do I think? Because what matters is what the Pacto thinks, because he just has to rubber stamp whatever they send to him. That's a little bit how it's working. I mean, suddenly they give the Chamber of Deputies the Reforma Telecomunicaciones, and they tell him, you have 5 days and don't move a comma. It's I don't know if that's what you want in the United States for the Washington Post that has been praising the Pacto, but it has had some implications.
Probably what we'll do with immigration.
Exactly. Now, moving very quickly to the research and development question, President Peña, I'm member of the board of constitute, and there is a big project to expand expenditure from 0.4 of GDP right now to 1 point of GDP by the end of the administration. It's an extremely ambitious reform. We've heard it before. And even if they were to get the money, the complexities for spending it well are not minor. So let's see how it moves. But for this year, CONACYTA has extra resources, and they are planning to invest it in new centers, hiring more people. So we'll see some sort of impact in the short run. Whether that's sustainable or not will depend, of course, on the fiscal reform and other pressures, spending pressures within the government. And is Mexico very dependent on foreign investment in high technology? I hope we would be more dependent, which means I hope we would have more investment in the sector. If you compare the exports of Mexico of high technology compared to other similar countries like Mexico, it's one of the success stories, and the more you stay depending on them, the more you create the density that will allow you to increase the value added, etc., as we've seen in the automobile industry, where suddenly we have such a density. Every day you open the newspaper in Mexico, you read some new firm, some new investment in auto parts, because the density has become so packed that there's an incentive to come to Mexico. So I don't see that as a problem. It has to be a company with good investment in terms of creating research centers, good investment in terms of helping firms that have the capacity to invest in more development in Mexico, suppliers adding value in Mexico. But in itself, I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a problem that if you only export copper or whatever, no? So in that sense, I think it's positive.
By the way, there was a $1.3 billion investment announced just for Mexico City about 3 or 4 days ago, including Miguel Hidalgo.
I'd like you to thank our panelists here before we move on to the next session. Thank you so much, both of you. Chris, will we take a break now, or should we just keep going? We're just going to keep going. If you want to step out for a second, we've got a very busy agenda. The next panel is going to focus on questions on public security. And I'd just like to make a small announcement. Next week on Thursday, the 18th, in the morning, we're very honored to be able to receive the Secretary of the Interior of Mexico. Secretary Osorio Chong will be coming here to the Wilson Center to give a public presentation on the outlook for public security and justice in Mexico. So we hope to see you all here. Luis, would you like to come up and chair the final session? It's a nightmare?
It's a nightmare. No, the ambassador arrived.
I was going to say, I think with these.
What?
And you just arrived in Washington. Say nothing. Say nothing.
Oh my God.
There's not a major security announcement right now.
And I'm going to speak, and I'm going to be the first public official in Mexico of this government that actually speaks abroad.
In Washington, yeah.
In Washington,
A week before Osorio Chong. Good luck.
And abroad. Well, I feel more calm now. Yeah. Be gentle. Póngase muy diferente. No te pongas el color de tu blusa. O no pongas el color de tu blusa. Estamos chupando tranquilos. Tengo. a Luis Rubio aquí.
Voy a saludar al embajador y nos empezamos.
Estupendo, cuando quieras. Tengo a Luis Rubio aquí. A Elizondo, que es mi maestro allá. Tengo a la prensa y encima acabo de llegar Eduardo. Y le digo, bueno, pues vas a hablar tú, yo no hablo ni madres. Le digo, holy shit, just what I need. Me dice, entonces no voy. Le digo que la canción nunca me he escuchado hablar.
Mi argumento central es, tenemos un problema.
Puta, es una pesadilla. O sea, de verdad es una pesadilla. Al embajador, Elizondo Mario Corra allá. ¿Quieres que me lo sabe lo que me decís? ¿Quieres que me lo diga? Sí, a mí me mola. ¿Quieres que me lo lleve? ¿Y a la prensa? ¿Quieres que me lo lleve? No, ya déjalo. Ya. No, es o mi graduación o me van a enterrar. Ay, no, ay, no.
No, yo traigo un argumento de que para mí
Estoy un poco bromeando.
El problema es político e institucional.
Ahí me voy a agarrar. Sí, porque el problema es institucional.
Tú empiezas tú primero.
¿Empiezo yo primero? No, hombre. ¿Yo hablo primero?
No sé.
No, yo creo que en el programa estás tú primero, ¿no?
Okay. Entonces empiezo yo. Mejor, así me contestas.
No, claro. Además, digo, va a estar divertido. O sea, ya estoy aquí.
No va a estar de acuerdo.
Ya estoy aquí, ya.
Yo estoy diciendo que no hay.
Va a estar divertido. Pues es que está bien. Pero lo de las instituciones está interesante. Va a estar divertido.
Lo que digo es que no tenemos una nueva estrategia de seguridad.
Y yo la voy a presentar.
Está muy bien.
¿Ya?
Yo digo que no tenemos una nueva estrategia de seguridad, que estamos haciendo lo mismo que veníamos haciendo antes.
Sí, estamos. Operacionalmente estamos haciendo lo mismo.
Estamos haciendo lo mismo, porque yo creo que un cambio de paradigma o un shift en el modelo implicaría poner en el centro lo local, poner en el centro lo institucional.
Bueno, muchas gracias, ya. Con eso, o sea, si dices eso, yo ya...
Eso
o sea,
puede ser.
¿en dónde quieres ir a comer? O sea, ya.
Pero entonces dile dile a Luis que empiece.
Sí. No, estás en el programa tú primero.
Pero déjame poner yo mis gráficas.
¿Cómo? ¿Tú traes tu PowerPoint también?
Traigo unas gráficas. ¿No?
Entonces, no sé. Y aquí está la... Donde tú quieras.
Que nos ayuden, ¿eh? Ah, sí, aquí está. El mío está aquí. Es que yo bajé la tuya y no sé cuál es. A ver.
¿Cómo?
¿Que baje la tuya? Yo empiezo si quieres.
Como tú quieras.
Tú dime.
No, tú dime. Tú estás en el programa primero y yo creo que tú...
¿Estás seguro que estoy en el programa primero?
Sí, estoy seguro. Es más, ve el programa. Luis, ella está en el programa primero, ¿verdad? Empieza ella.
Yo empiezo primero.
Sí, que empiece.
¿Te parece? Dice el embajador que te sientas intimidado.
Hijo, pues ya lo sé. Pinche Walo, ya lo sé. O sea.
Good morning. We'll start with the third session, this one on security. We'll have first Edna Jaime, who is the president of the Mexico Evalúa think tank in Mexico City, a new institution or relatively new institution that has been working on assessing the impact of policies in Mexico and has spent a good deal of her time and resources on issues of security and justice. And then we'll have Ariel Matsazos, sorry, who works at the Mexican embassy here. He's an expert on security issues and has been working on this for almost a decade. He's one of the strongest analytical minds on the subject on the government side. Edna, please.
Thank you very much, Luis. Good morning, everyone. I am very honored and grateful for the invitation. And Luis, congratulations for your book, on your book. I would like to spend my 15 minutes answering the question of whether we are faced with a new security strategy. And my answer is no. And as a matter of fact, I think we will be seeing more of what we saw in the past for several months and even years. By this I mean that the security strategy will continue to be supported by federal forces in specific crisis regions. This has been the case during the government's first 4 months and will remain so in the near future because we lack the view, the tools, and institutional capacities to do things differently, at least in the short run. In other words, there are structural constraints on what we can do. I am convinced that the crisis of violence and insecurity we are experiencing is both a crisis of our governmental structure and a consequence of our profound institutional weakness. And in this point, I agree completely with what Luis states and argues in his book. I think that a strategy shift, even more, a paradigm shift, should therefore be based on this understanding and on the fact that security has to be promoted and achieved at the local level. A close friend of mine says that what we have tried to deal with the phenomenon of violence and insecurity from a centralized, extremely aggregate perspective, when the problem should be dealt with from a microsocial level. Unfortunately, we have not fully assimilated what I think is the essence of a new paradigm, a new understanding of the phenomenon. The goal of restoring peace, as President Peña has said, involves this understanding, but more importantly, the creation of the conditions to make it possible. This entails an incredible task of institutional construction that is not currently on the agenda, or at least not with the necessary priority and emphasis. As Luis remarked earlier, the new government actions are dictated by a logic of concentrating power, and I think that not on institutional transformation, at least in the realm of security and justice. Probably this may have positive repercussions on violence levels, but it will not solve our underlying problem of institutional weakness and its consequences. Having said this, the rest of my talk will be organized in 2 parts. The first is a description of the states of the affairs. I will present just 2 slides. The first one, I will present the tendencies in violence in the country and some selected indicators to support my statement of institutional weakness. In the second part, I will address the security actions undertaken during the new administration's first few months in government, and I will conclude by examining the main challenges ahead. I should point out that the analysis refers to our internal challenges. The transnational component of the phenomenon will not be included in this presentation, although it's crucial to be both. It is crucial to both understanding and addressing it. I will focus on the factors over which we have control and can change. As you can see in this chart that presents monthly average, sorry. As you can see in the chart that presents monthly average of intentional homicides, its levels remain very high. In fact, intentional homicide average during the first 3 months of the new administration in office is higher than the one registered during the last administration. Calderon began his term with the lowest number of homicides in the country's recent history, as you can see in the graph. Peña took over the government during a downward trend, but at much higher levels than his predecessor. If this trend continues, and even if the number drops, it's very probable that Peña's deaths will outnumber those of the previous administration. What capacities do we have for dealing with crime? The answer, unfortunately, is that very few. The country's security forces are extremely fragmented, insufficiently trained, and many have been infiltrated by crime. Outside the federal police force, there have been no projects to transform the police other than certain isolated cases of restructuring and reform. We do not have a state force, either in quantity or quality, capable of dealing with this context of crime. The majority of Mexico's policemen are not qualified and inspire very little trust among the population. Just 20% strongly trust the federal police, and just 10% state police. This produces a situation of deep vulnerability in the face of crime, making it necessary for federal forces, by which I mean the Mexican Federal Police, Army, Navy, to intervene to contain crisis or reduce the risk. And this has produced a very, what I call a symbiotic dependence relationship, because these interventions, which should be transitory, has become permanent in several parts of the country, making any change extremely difficult. The risk for Presidente Peña will be to maintain this symbiotic relationship if he does not establish absolute time limits and fails to promote an in-depth reform of the police to strengthen the capacities of security forces at the local level. There is a risk that he will end his term doing precisely what he wishes to distance himself from, repeating the policy and the way of doing things that marked President Calderón's security strategy. In the area of justice, our capacities are also very severely limited. The following graph shows the capacities of the local justice systems for resolving homicides. The graph clearly shows our ceiling, less than 4,000 homicides per year on average. During the last administration, particularly from 2010 on, the rate exceeded 20,000 homicides a year. This demonstrates the size of the impunity gap. If disaggregate numbers is presented on a state-by-state basis, we find states where the situation is even worse. With these levels of impunity, there is no guarantee of access to justice, nor are criminals dissuaded for committed crimes, the two main functions the penal system should perform. There is no construction of authority by the state either. Indeed, in practical terms, the state is absent when justice is also absent. In my opinion, it is building these capacities and constructing this authority that the basis for the country's eventual pacification could be achieved. President Peña is not unfamiliar with these challenges. During the last session of the National Council of Public Security, when he was already President of Mexico, Peña explained the components of his new security strategy. And these topics were the central part of his proposal. Like other means of dealing with the problems, which included a focus on prevention and the protection of human rights, and on more effective mechanisms of achieving cooperation between the actors involved in this issue. However, based on the actions rather than the rhetoric of the past 4 months of government, there is still no well-designed agenda for institutional reform in the fields relating security. Within the reformist seal of the new administration, institutional reform in this realm is not an issue. The first 4 months of this administration were spent on the administrative restructuring involved in merging the Secretariat of Public Security with the Secretariat of the Interior. This restructuring produced an extremely powerful secretariat that concentrates security tasks in its various areas and subsumes them under a single chief. This new secretariat has now stitched together what was fragmented during the previous administration. Still, it is not clear what for. During these first 4 months, priority has also been placed on a crime prevention project, which, to our knowledge, will design new programs or use existing ones to deal with communities and persons that presents risk factors to make them prone to breaking the law. Some people have already dubbed it the pronasol of prevention, another way of implying its political rationale. Prevention is indeed the new phase of the security policy, and this public policy too has been presented as a paradigm shift. I think it does not have that dimension. During these 4 months, the foundations have been laid for the creation of the National Gendarmerie, a new federal security force about whose functions and characteristics we know little, yet which is neither a new model nor part of a more ambitious transformation project on a national level. I think that it may further fragment Mexico's map of security forces and reproduce the model described earlier of symbiotic dependence, in which the federal forces deployed to certain regions reduce the incentives to reform and strengthen local forces. So, in answer to the earlier question of whether what I have described constitutes a paradigm shift in security policy, my answer is no, or rather, not yet, because as I see it, the essence of the problem I have mentioned has not been addressed, namely the extreme weakness of the security and justice institutions and the enormous incompetence of local governments in dealing with the problem under their jurisdiction. The narrative does not change the reality, and the features of the new strategy closely resembles those of Calderón's failed one. Perhaps the challenge posed by violence and crime in Mexico will force the government to conclude that there will be not let up until the profound problems that breathe life into crime and violence are resolved. They must realize that our problem is of institutional weakness and not only an ineffective pan-government that failed to use the power resources available to tackle the problem. This erroneous approach and diagnosis reminds me one of the years under President Fox, when it was thought that by changing the party in government, the country itself will change. Perhaps the new government, just like the naive President Fox, assumed that if it returned to power, peace will miraculously be restored in the country. Thank you.
Well, Edna, you have laid the ground. Now, Ariel. And bear in mind that your boss is here.
Thanks for putting additional pressure on.
While we're waiting, if I just may add, Mexico, just because this was a pretty dire look at the situation. Mexico City right now is safer than it has been in a generation. The entire Yucatan Peninsula, including states like Campeche, are actually safer than Canada. Other success stories include Aguascalientes, Querétaro, Puerto Vallarta is a very safe destination, Los Cabos, etc. So within this context, obviously the major success story is Mexico City. That's why we have 14,000 close-circuit cameras. But not all
But that's not the point. The point that she was driving at is that institutions are very weak, and that's true in every one of those destinations that you just mentioned. Please.
I would like to Mexico City, but
it is.
we can talk.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here, and congratulations again on your new book, Luis. I'm going to certainly give a word from my sponsor, but at the same time, I'll try to just analyze the so-called new strategy of President Peña Nieto's government. When I was 19 years old, I remember that there was this debate in the news in Mexico about the economic crisis and about dollarization, a term that it's probably now even ridiculous, but we really thought about dollarizing the economy in Mexico. And we were almost like now thinking very strongly, having many points of view in the media about what was going to happen with our country, who was irredeemably repeating economic crisis every 6 years. Well, what happened is that we did our homework and we adopted a state policy that, regardless of the political colors or the party that is in government, has now taken to Mexico to a certainly unprecedented macroeconomic stability that we are enjoying currently. We certainly have a lot of challenges in that department, but it made a great and a big change for us. A few weeks ago, President Peña Nieto stated, while presenting the new strategy or the new program for the prevention of violence and crime in Mexico, that we have to make the transition from a national strategy of public security into a state policy of public security. So what I'm about to talk about now is just a few general lines of this new strategy. But in reality, I think it's about time that we start calling it the new state policy of public security. It was with a state policy that Mexico solved its fair precondition for full development, macroeconomic stability, and it will be with a state policy that Mexico will solve the second precondition for development, which is security. The new strategy or the new state policy for public security will seeks to address the roots and causes of crime rather than just its consequences. And here, I certainly agree with Luis and Edna, who have mentioned many times before institutional weakness. The real problem in Mexico is not one of security by itself, is not isolated. And the real problem in Mexico is not organized crime or drug dealing. The real problem in Mexico, behind everything, lies institutional weakness, especially in the sectors of security and justice, the prisons, and all that. So addressing the roots and causes of crime, rather than just its consequences, implies addressing institutional weakness and strengthening institutions so that they can have presence all throughout the territory in Mexico, and thus reaching a deployment of the state where the state is not that strong right now. The change of paradigm that Edna was talking about is to create a more democratic public security with an integral focus based on prevention, citizens' participation, and a redesign of the police justice models with utmost respect for human rights. Most of us think that security is made by the police, and that in the United States, for example, security is strong because the police is strong. Well, the police is strong, but it's not only that what explains why in the United States security or public security is strong. It's also because community owns their public space, where there are cafes, where there are streets or public plazas where the people walks. There is a very low rate of crime, generally. What we are trying to address here is the community should be recovered by the citizens to enhance the public security in those spaces. The change of paradigm implies that the citizens and their families recover the public spaces, which are, of course, at the same time supported or, let's say, guaranteed by the police, by the presence of the police in every corner of our country. The new model of police is also important. It's important to have one single command of police in every state. And one single command means coordination, but it also means that all the police will undertake the same tests and the same, let's say, polygraph tests or the same evaluation processes than all the others, and they will receive standard or uniform capacitation training on their job. And it also means that the police will have jurisdiction in at least a whole state of the 32 that exist in Mexico. I was listening to Congressman Barrios Gomez, and he was saying that in Mexico City the security was enhanced by the closed circuit cameras. Well, not only that, and I don't think that's the main issue. In Mexico City, there are 35,000 police elements. In the whole country, there are 36,000 federal police elements. So in Mexico City, we have the same amount of police officers almost than in the whole country we have federal police. In Mexico City, if I remember correctly, and if these numbers are still up to date, the average age of a policeman is 45. They are not precisely slim, and they have a 38, a Smith & Wesson 38 as their, gun. They have good cars sometimes, but they do arrive very quickly when you call them, and they arrive in numbers. It is possible to get, 300 policemen in 20 minutes in a public space. It is possible to have a car with or two cars with policemen, responding to an emergency in 2-3 minutes. So that's, critical mass and having jurisdiction in the whole Mexico City makes a difference. And the new police model is all about that. We are not saying that Mexico City's model is aspirational, because in many ways it is not. But in terms of critical mass and in terms of how it works, it is a very good example of what a good number of policemen can make. The number of federal police shall be increased at least to 100,000. Of course, 150,000 would be better. But that's partly what the police and justice models are all about. Of course, this oral accusatory system in terms of justice is also a very important part that we have to reach. There is a deadline there in 2015, but that's all part of this new paradigm that President Peña Nieto was talking about. In the end, it's about strengthen the security and justice institutions to address institutional weakness that Edna and, of course, Luis Rubio have talked about. It's about completing the deployment and presence of the state throughout the country in terms of security and justice. Mexico does not have general institutional weakness. We are quite strong in many other issues. In fact, we are strong in the majority of them. And we have a great presence of many other sectors and their institutions in Mexico. Our problem is security and justice. We have to strengthen that presence, that deployment and presence of the state throughout the country in terms of security and justice. This means, of course, institutionalizing the solution to the problem of violence and organized crime, but not only organized crime, all crime, because when you have presence of the state throughout the territory, then you're not selectively addressing organized crime, you're addressing all kinds of crime. And you are actually addressing the roots of crime, which are not only solved by enforcing the law. That's rather addressing more like the consequences. You address the roots of crime while restoring the social fabric, while fostering that people regain the public spaces in their communities. You enhance also institutional strength and the presence of the state when you counter money laundering. This is one of the two main focus of the new state policy for public security, addressing money laundering. This is not like terrorism. Terrorism is about ideology. And it's very difficult to take the ideology out of the mind or of the mind of someone. But this is about business. This is about making money. If you stop the business from flowing, if you disrupt or bankrupt the criminals, which are an illegal business, but in the end they are a business, then you are actually attacking the problem at its roots. And we also have, you are disrupting the ability of the criminal groups to reproduce their model in time and geography. But at the same time, and I would like to talk about this, I was not going to make a big emphasis, but almost everyone here has mentioned this part, the weapons. The other big focus of the new state policy for public security is weapons trafficking. In Mexico, as you already know, the majority of weapons come from the United States. If these numbers are still up to date, we have around 110,000 gun shops, of which around 11,000 are in the border. They make, by far, for the majority of the business of the gun shops in the United States. Here, the drugs are, if we take the drug problem, as all businesses, the majority of the people required for the business is not in the production of the business and is not in the trafficking part or the transport of the business. It's in the distribution, like in every business. Distribution in the United States is made by around 1 million legal residents or citizens of the United States present, divided or organized in 20,000, let's call them gangs. They may very well be called small cartels, present in all 50 states with free access to weapons. That in Mexico doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I mean, to acquire a weapon in Mexico is really very difficult. If you want to acquire it illegally, it's very difficult. If you want to acquire it through the army, which is the one who controls weapons, believe me, it's really, really, really something that takes a lot of time. You have to undergo psychological tests, you have to undergo toxicological tests, you have to prove that you have an honest way of living. So here, that doesn't happen. Here, they have free access to weapons. And 1 million people, legal residents, present in all 50 states, distributing drugs to a base market of 45 million persons, now more, have free access to weapons. So this is a situation that is very difficult for Mexico. The United States is getting the drugs that are trafficked through Mexico here, not all of them. Now, the majority of states have legalized marijuana for practical purposes. I mean, you need the prescription of a doctor, but okay. I guess you can get that more or less easily. But for the rest of the drugs, they are being trafficked through Mexico. Okay, well, you get the drugs from there, but we get the guns from here. And just to set up or to put an example of a recent past where we didn't have this problem, between 1994 and 2004, President Clinton's ban on assault rifles was in place. Well, that's among the safest and most peaceful periods in the recent history in Mexico, even including the revolution. So in reality, the start of the previous administration is not the one that saw the lowest rates on violence. It was between 1994 and 2004 when we saw in many places of Mexico European rates of violence. It is very important, it is critical that we understand that without having a holistic approach into the problem, we are not going to solve this problem. We have to address institutional weakness, we have to address money laundering, we have to address guns trafficking, we also have to address the social fabric, opening opportunities for our youth, and enhancing the intelligence capabilities of the institutions. But in the end, the objective is not ending organized crime or just finishing with the problem of drug dealing or drug trafficking, because if we are, let's say, in a hypothetical world to legalize them, then we will have other types of crime that we cannot legalize. In the end, we have to strengthen the institutions and recover peace and tranquility for the Mexican families. This is the main objective of the new state policy for public security, recovering peace and tranquility for the Mexican families in their communities. You know, crime can be taken down to a level of public policing problem if we approach it in a holistic approach. I'm not saying that it should only be dealt by police. Quite the contrary, as I said, it's more a holistic approach. But we certainly can take it as it is a problem of just public security in Europe and even here. So it's time to address that. It's time to do a shift in the paradigm, like Edna was saying. And it's certainly time to strengthen the institutions and identify that as the main problem that lies behind all the security and organized crime and justice issue in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Edna. So we have two views, what has happened and what needs to happen, and both are very complementary, and there are no fundamental contradictions between them. And the core story is the same, that Mexico has very weak institutions in this area and has to deal with a very complex problem in a way that actually changes the paradigm. The floor is open. Any questions? Please, Richard.
Thank you, Luis. Richard Downey. And thank you very much, both of you, for a wonderful panel. Very interesting. And my question is for Edna. You know, it's very appealing, your initial argument of saying, look, we need to change this paradigm, and going from sort of an aggregate effort to focus on security towards a localized effort. And the reason I felt that was appealing was for exactly the reasons that the Congressman Barrios mentioned. Mexico City, Querétaro, Aguascalientes are very safe, yet there are other locations in Mexico that are not so safe. So, you know, it is a localized problem. But on the other hand, for exactly the reasons that Luis mentioned, and you all mentioned it, institutional weakness, perhaps at the local level is where the institutions are most weak and most susceptible to corruption. So how do you resonate that, or how do you make that work when you have the most problem at the local level to enforce a strategy that is directed where it really needs to be at that local level? Thank you.
Let's go to the next one, please. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. I'm Ted Wilkinson, Foreign Service Institute. It's a little unclear to me, and I'd like both of Ariel and Edna comment, if you could, on the status of the consolidation at the state level of state police forces. At one point, there was legislation that was proposed. There was a lot of resistance. It means political power will change hands, and particularly in divided states, so there's resistance consolidating. Yet some states, Chihuahua, for instance, has moved ahead and is in fact consolidating. Others are not. Is it possible to do it without federal legislation, or how do the states actually accomplish this? Thank you.
Ariel, do you want to start?
Well. Institutional weakness at the local level and corruption. In reality, corruption is, as a matter of fact, the result of institutional weakness. Corruption is not something that you have to, or you can solve in an isolated manner. When you solve institutional weakness, when you strengthen institutions, corruption kind of starts solving by itself that problem. Of course, there are other things that you have to guarantee, and there are processes, and there, you know, the vetting and all that. But to solve institutional weakness at the local level and thus corruption, you need political will. Yes, that is there, but you also need coordination, and not only coordination among the federal institutions, but also coordination with the governors. This is not, as sometimes it's seen, a problem where the governors, and Lázaro Cárdenas is here, he knows this very well. He was the first to talk to President Calderón about this issue. You know, this is not a matter that the federation has to solve by itself. It's rather the duty of the federation, of the federal government, to support the governors on their efforts. The governors are not there just to, you know, allow the government to pass and solve the issue. They are there to engage fully in the issue, and the federal government has to support the governors and work together. Likewise, the governors have to work together at the municipal level on these issues. So that's more or less the mechanism. Coordination, but at the same time, also sharing, you know, the solution in terms of the governors executing or articulating the solution to this problem, supported by or backed up by the federal government. And in terms of the question of TED, consolidation of state police forces. Well, consolidation of state police forces is in a still very early stage. For the majority of reasons are that yes, we need legislation to be passed in every state, in the local congresses, for the local polices to turn into state police. But yes, there is a way to do it without passing through those legislations, at least temporarily. President Peña Nieto, in the same presentation or speech that I mentioned a few minutes ago, when he presented the new program for the prevention of violence and crime, said that he was calling on the state to make local agreements. You know, the municipal police can make agreements between, let's say, themselves with the state, so that the state can have a practical single command while the local Congress approves the creation of the state police. That can happen. President Peña Nieto has called, for the states to do that, and we'll see in the next weeks or months if that, in the end, this becomes a reality. But the police model will happen in the end.
But no federal legislation is necessary.
No, federal legislation is not necessary for this. It's rather a problem that it's stuck at the state level and the municipal level right now.
And as I presented, I think that a paradigm shift should entail this change in vision. We need local government to be responsible and capable of providing the conditions for peace to be restored at the very micro level. Mm-hmm. But in this, I think this is the part of our government structure that is the less capable of doing that. So what can we do? And probably it could sound paradoxical, but I think that we need the federation leadership, the president leadership to conduct the transformation. Mm-hmm. And we were talking that the president, that the new president has been accumulating power, and I think it can use it to promote this type of reforms that are needed. I think we are not going to solve the problem until local governments are capable, and until local capabilities, institutional capabilities are improved. And I think it's a tremendous task of institutional and construction and of coordination, but I'm worried because I don't see it in the agenda. I think that the emphasis are not in this point. Mm-hmm.
Conceptually, the problem is the same throughout the country, but the specific realities place by place are very different, both because of the historical nature of problems and because of the patterns of crime. Much of the very violent crime has to do with roads and routes to the U.S., and that changes everything because of the firepower of these organizations. The paradox is that some of the hardest hit places like Chihuahua or Monterrey, for instance, are attempting the biggest transformations, whereas some of those, like Yucatan or Mexico City, are staying with the old police models. Who knows if 10 years hence, if things work out, we'll end up with very modern, very efficient institutions in those places that today are seen as doldrums, whereas the places which have shown just very low levels of at least violent crime, but normal levels or high levels of non-lethal crime end up being just as bad then. Who knows? These are things that will evolve as each one of the states and local governments or cities accept or don't accept the process of change that the administration attempts or pretends to attempt. Thank you very much for your. There's another question.
Yes,
last one.
David Johnson. I haven't heard anything this morning about the reform of criminal dispute resolution, judicial reform, and was wondering if it was a priority and what its status and trajectory was. And second, and perhaps more provocative, would a significant Foreign Corrupt Practices Act case against Walmart for its practices in Mexico have a significant catalytic effect on reform in Mexico, or would it just be a sideshow?
I'm not very much aware of the Walmart case.
Me neither.
But I'll speak from an analyst's point of view. I think that everything that happens that is wrong ends up teaching us something and ends up rather, sooner or later crystallizing or reflecting in legislation. That's all I can say.
You want to say anything on judicial?
There was a profound judicial reform, in a penal reform in the country. It is quite stale. Stale is a correct word. It is stale. It is a very profound reform, and I think it again needs the president leadership to move it forward. It is a reform that of course will have an impact of the levels of impunity I was talking about in my presentation, but it would take time. From the 32 states that only 5 of them have completed this reform, and we are starting to see important shifts and changes in the way justice is procured in the country, but it will take time, and again the leadership it needs to be in the agenda, and it needs to be pushed to be completed in the terms it was designed and at the beginning. Mm-hmm.
We started this morning with the statement that their opportunity is enormous and the conditions for grabbing the opportunity are extraordinary. This panel just shows that there are enormous challenges to be dealt with, and the question is whether that opportunity will actually be grabbed. Duncan, you have the last word.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you to all of our panelists today. Thank you so much to everybody for coming to the Wilson Center. See you again here very, very soon. Please pick up a copy of Luis's book on your way out. Later on today, we'll have the PDF version up online that we can. It's already up. Okay, fantastic. It's just been done. So it's hot off the press, hot off the internet. And I hope to see you all here in less than a week's time for the visit of Secretary of Gobernación Osorio Chong. It should be a fascinating discussion then. Thanks to you all. Have a great day.
Ahorita verás después de.
Ya está redactando el abogado de renuncia de Osvaldo, ya está ahí.